He had spent 22 years learning how to disappear into noise, the crack of rifle fire, the roar of rotors, the kind of silence that comes right before everything goes wrong. So when the world finally went quiet for good, when there was nothing left to listen for, he didn't know what to do with his hands. His name was Marcus Greer, and he had retired from the Navy SEALs 11 months ago, though retired was a word other people used. He called it something else on the nights when he sat on the back porch of the farmhouse in eastern Tennessee and watched the dark settle over the ridgeline like a held breath. He called it after. Everything was just after now. The farmhouse had belonged to his grandfather, a quiet man who had also come home from a war and found that the best medicine was acreage and solitude and the particular honesty of physical work. Marcus had understood that instinctively when he'd signed the deed last spring, a week after the funeral, 2 weeks after the doctors had said everything they had to say. He didn't need neighbors. He didn't need a therapist's waiting room with its soft instrumental music and a tissue box on every surface. He needed the smell of wood smoke and cold dirt and the sound of nothing in particular. What he did not need, what he had been very clear about with himself, was a dog. This required some explaining because Marcus Greer was not a man who dislikes dogs. He had worked alongside military working dogs for the better part of a decade. He knew what they were capable of, knew it in the way you know a thing that has saved your life more than once. But knowing and wanting were different countries, and he had closed the border on that particular territory the morning he'd watched a Belgian Malinois named Shepherd get loaded into a black bag at a forward operating base in Syria, and the handler, a 24-year-old from Savannah named Cole, had stood there with his hands at his sides and his face completely still, the way faces go still when there is too much happening inside them for any of it to show. Marcus had not owned a dog since. He was not interested in that kind of love again, the kind that ends. So he was not looking for anything on the Tuesday morning in late October, when he drove into Clover Ridge to pick up weather stripping and a bag of concrete mix. He was not looking at the gas station parking lot, or at the woman loading groceries into an old Jeep, or at anything beyond the hardware store awning directly ahead of him. He was not looking at the cardboard box beside the dumpster. But then the box moved. He didn't stop the truck immediately. He drove another 20 feet, turned into the hardware store lot, sat with the engine idling for a moment. He told himself it was probably raccoons. Clover Ridge had a raccoon problem. Everyone said so. He turned the truck around. The box was a produce crate, the kind that once held apples or sweet potatoes, and someone had folded the top flaps down and set it in the narrow strip of shade beside the dumpster, as though this constituted care. There was an old dish towel inside. That was the whole of it. He crouched beside the box and looked in. 3 puppies looked back at him. They were young, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 7, the age when a dog is mostly head and paw and a pair of eyes that have not yet learned to be cautious. One was a deep auburn color with a black saddle and ears that were still deciding whether to stand up or stay folded. One was the pale silver gray of birch bark with a smudge of darker fur across her nose that made her look perpetually skeptical. The third was nearly black, with a single white mark on his chest, no bigger than a thumbprint. All 3 were shaking. It was 42 degrees. The dish towel was damp. Marcus sat back on his heels and looked at the parking lot. No one else had noticed the box, or if they had, they decided it wasn't their problem. He looked back at the puppies. The auburn one had stopped shaking long enough to press his nose against the cardboard wall and sniff in the direction of Marcus's boot. "No," Marcus said out loud, to no one in particular. He stood up and went into the hardware store and bought the weather stripping and the concrete mix. He loaded both into the truck bed. He got in the cab. He sat there for a full 2 minutes with the engine off, looking at the steering wheel. Then he drove back to the box, wrapped all 3 puppies in his flannel shirt, and put them on the passenger seat. "This is temporary," he told them. The gray one sneezed on his sleeve. The drive back to the farmhouse took 18 minutes. In those 18 minutes, the auburn pup climbed onto Marcus's thigh and fell asleep there, which made using the turn signal complicated. The black one with the white chest mark pressed himself into the corner of the seat with his eyes wide open, watching everything with an expression of profound alertness, as though he was cataloging information for a report he intended to file later. The gray one ate a corner of the road atlas Marcus kept in the door pocket, and then looked deeply satisfied about it. Marcus named them before he'd even turned onto the gravel road. He tried not to, but they named themselves in the way that some things just do. The auburn one was Flint, because of the color and because he reminded Marcus of something that could catch fire. The gray one was Sage, because of the smudge on her nose and because she already had opinions. The black one with the white mark was Scout, and Marcus didn't examine that particular choice too closely. He just knew it fit. He set them up in the mudroom with a cardboard box lined with an old army blanket, a shallow bowl of water, and the softest food he could find in the back of his pantry, which turned out to be a can of cream of chicken soup that he thinned with warm water and probably wasn't ideal. But they ate it like it was the finest meal they'd ever encountered, which technically it was. Temporary, he reminded them. Flint crawled into the bowl after he finished eating and went to sleep in it. The calls Marcus made that evening were brief and productive. The Clover Ridge Animal Shelter had a 2-week hold. His nearest neighbor, a woman named Carol who raised goats and knew everyone in the county, told him that the shelter was badly overcrowded and that the puppies were a mixed breed, probably part shepherd, part something else. Hard to say. And that mixed breed pups over 5 weeks old were difficult to place. She said this last part gently, in the tone of someone who knew what it meant. Marcus thanked her and hung up. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked into the mudroom, where Sage had somehow removed the army blanket from the box and was dragging it toward the water bowl with tremendous concentration for no discernible reason. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked. Sage stopped, looked at him, then continued dragging the blanket. He went back to the kitchen and made himself a bowl of soup, actual soup, from a pot, the kind his grandmother used to make on cold days, and ate it standing at the counter, the way he'd eaten most of his meals for the past 11 months. Sitting at the table had started feeling like something you did when there was someone to sit across from. He thought about Cole from Savannah, standing in that forward operating base with his hands at his sides. He thought about how Cole had not cried then, and how Marcus had wondered at the time whether he would cry later, when there was somewhere private to do it, and how he'd never found out because Cole had rotated out the following week, and they hadn't spoken since. He thought about his wife, Laura, not about her death. He'd gotten very precise, these past 11 months, about not thinking about that particular 48 hours unless it was unavoidable. He thought about her the other way. The way she'd drunk her coffee, which was not so much drinking as an ongoing negotiation with the mug. The way she'd pronounce particularly with an extra syllable that appeared and disappeared depending on her mood. The way she'd always said in the last 5 years of their marriage that they should get a dog. A real dog. A dog that would sleep on the bed and eat from a ceramic bowl and have a name chosen by committee. He'd always said maybe next year. And then there were no more next years left. The noise from the mudroom stopped. Marcus looked up. Scout was sitting in the kitchen doorway, the army blanket dragging behind him like a cape. He was looking at Marcus with the same cataloging expression he'd worn in the truck, except now it had a quality of patience in it, as if he'd arrived at a conclusion and was waiting for Marcus to catch up. "You're not supposed to be in here," Marcus said. Scout walked across the kitchen, sat down directly in front of Marcus's feet, and put one small white-marked paw on the toe of his boot. Marcus looked down at that paw for a long time. Then he looked up at the window above the sink, where the last light was going out over the ridge, and the farmhouse was getting the way. Farmhouses getting the way farmhouses get in October evenings, all shadow and wood smoke and the distant sound of the creek. "Okay," he said, very quietly. Not to Scout. Not to anyone. Just to the kitchen, to the quiet, to whatever was listening. Okay. The first weeks were a lesson in humility. Marcus had trained with Navy SEALs. He had completed Hell Week twice, once forward, once as an instructor watching other men find out what they were made of. He had been cold and wet and sleepless and in genuine danger, and he had kept his composure through all of it. He had never before encountered a force of opposition as concentrated and unyielding as 3 8-week-old shepherd mix puppies who had collectively decided that the farmhouse was theirs. Sage discovered the boot shelf on a Tuesday and systematically relocated every right boot to a location that never matched the left. Not destroyed. Just moved. Always to somewhere logical within the logic of her own system, which bore no relationship to any system Marcus could identify. When he lined them up again on Wednesday morning, he found them redistributed by Wednesday afternoon. He started keeping one boot on and one off until he needed to go outside, which was a compromise he was not proud of. Flint's jurisdiction was the back porch, which he patrolled with the energy of a small animal who has appointed himself responsible for everything that moves within 20 feet. Squirrels, leaves, the shadow of the weather vane. All of it required his attention and a series of high-pitched declarations that Marcus eventually stopped trying to interrupt, because Flint would simply wait for silence, watch Marcus's face with an expression of respectful disagreement, and then resume. He was not loud for loudness's sake. He had things to say. Marcus found himself, after the second week, actually listening to which bark meant squirrel, and which meant something on the road, and which meant wind shifted, and there's something I don't recognize yet. This was useful information. He hadn't expected it to be. Scout didn't make noise. Scout watched. In the evening, when Flint had exhausted himself chasing whatever needed chasing and Sage had completed whatever rearrangement was on her agenda for the day, Scout would appear beside Marcus on the porch at the kitchen table, once memorably at the edge of the shower when Marcus had forgotten to latch the bathroom door, and simply be there. Just present, in the uncomplicated way of a creature who has no interest in fixing you and therefore no stake in whether you're broken. He didn't lean in or whimper or perform comfort. He just arrived, settled, and stayed. Marcus started sitting at the kitchen table again. It happened so gradually that he didn't notice it was happening until he'd been doing it for several days. Scout would be under the table, not pressed against his leg, just nearby, and the act of sitting down with another living thing in the room made it feel less like an accusation. He started making more soup. Real soup, with vegetables and stock, in the cast-iron pot his grandfather had left behind. It took long enough that you had to stand in the kitchen for a while, and standing in the kitchen was easier when Flint was outside telling the weather vane what he thought of it, and Sage was conducting her organizational activities in the mudroom, and Scout was watching Marcus from the braided rug by the back door, with those dark, cataloging eyes that seemed to be running a continuous quiet assessment of whether Marcus was doing all right. He mostly wasn't, but he was doing better than before. The cold came down hard in the second week of November, and with it came the first real snow of the season, which arrived overnight and left 6 inches on the ground by morning. Marcus was up before light. He always was. A habit from years when being up before light was the difference between operating and being operated on, and he went out to the porch with his coffee and found all 3 puppies lined up at the door, noses pressed to the glass, watching the snow with 3 distinct expressions. Flint's was pure desire. Sage's was cautious evaluation. Scout's was the same careful assessment he brought to everything, as though the snow had information and he intended to gather it. Marcus opened the door. Flint went off the porch like a rocket and hit a snowdrift face first, and came up so covered in white that he looked like a different dog entirely, spinning in a circle of what could only be described as delight. Sage stepped to the edge of the porch, placed one paw in the snow, retracted it, considered, then placed it again with more commitment. Scout walked to Marcus's side, sat down, and looked out at the field with him as though they were colleagues surveying terrain. It was so cold Marcus's coffee steamed in long threads that the wind carried sideways. The sky was the pale gray of old pewter. Across the white field the ridgeline was dark with pine, and somewhere up there a hawk was making long arcs in the silence. Flint was still spinning. Sage had progressed to a careful circuit of the porch steps, testing each one. Scout's shoulder was just touching Marcus's knee. Marcus thought about Laura, who had grown up in Georgia and found snow genuinely exciting every single time, well into her 40s, who would have been out in that field already in her red coat, making footprints. He thought about her, and this time the thought was clean, not the 48 hours, not the hospital, not the doctor's careful voice. Just her, in her red coat, in a field of snow, laughing at something. He didn't realize he was smiling until Scout looked up at him. "Yeah," Marcus said, "I know." It was December when Scout found the fox. A red fox had gotten into the old chicken coop at the back of the property, a structure Marcus had never used, hadn't intended to use, had meant to dismantle in the spring. It had gotten in through a gap in the rotted floor and could not find its way back out. Marcus heard Scout at the back door before dawn, not whimpering. Scout did not whimper, but making a sound so quiet and deliberate that it woke Marcus out of sleep with the same precision as an alarm. He followed Scout across the snow-covered yard to the coop and found the fox crouched in the corner, a young female, her left foreleg at an angle that was wrong in the specific way of a break. She was watching Marcus with yellow eyes that held no softness but a great deal of intelligence. She was not aggressive. She was waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus drove her to the wildlife rehabilitator in Clover Ridge, a retired veterinarian named Harriet, who kept the clinic open from 7 to noon and ran the rest of it out of her home. Harriet said the leg was fixable, and that the fox would need 6 weeks, and then could be released in spring. She said Marcus had probably gotten there in time because of the temperature overnight. She said whoever found her saved her life. Marcus, on the drive home with Scout on the passenger seat, thought about the word found. In his experience, there were 2 kinds of finding. The first was accidental. You weren't looking, and something appeared. The second was intentional. You went out looking because something had told you to. Scout had gone out looking. You knew she was there, Marcus said. Scout looked out the passenger window at the passing snowfields. How long? Scout did not answer. Which was an answer. Carol from the goat farm brought a pie to the farmhouse the week before Christmas. She knocked on the door, and when Marcus opened it, she held out a pecan pie and said she'd made too many and didn't want them going to waste, which was a lie of courtesy that Marcus accepted because it was that kind of lie. He let her in, and they had coffee at the kitchen table, which Marcus now sat at regularly. And Sage immediately climbed into Carol's lap, despite weighing enough at this point that it was technically no longer a lap situation. She does that, Marcus said. I don't mind, Carol said. She was scratching behind Sage's ears, and Sage had the look of an animal who has achieved her goal. How are you getting along? Fine, Marcus said. Then, better. Then, they're a lot of work. Dobbs usually are. He told her about the fox and Scout's 4 a.m. summons, and Carol nodded as though this was entirely to be expected. Shepherds know things, she said. They always have, something in them that was never domesticated all the way. She looked at Scout, who was under the table but not quite touching Marcus's foot. That one especially. He watches everything, Marcus said. Who else is he going to watch out for? The question was simple and direct, and Carol clearly meant it simply and directly, without implication. But it landed in a place Marcus had been careful to keep empty for 11 months, and it stayed there. After Carol left, Marcus sat at the table for a long time. Outside, Flint was explaining something urgent to the weather vane. Sage had returned to the mudroom and was addressing some logistical concern Marcus had stopped trying to understand. Scout was under the table, his warm weight just barely resting against Marcus's boot. Marcus put his hand down and rested it on Scout's back. Scout didn't move, didn't turn around, just breathe, steadily, in the way of an animal that has been waiting for this without requiring it. The farmhouse was warm. The wood stove was clicking quietly. Outside, the first stars were coming out over the ridgeline, pale and early in the December dark. Marcus thought Laura would have loved this. Not as a wound, not as the hollow kind of thought that had preceded it for almost a year. Just as a fact, held lightly, like something you can put down and pick up again. He thought. She would have named the gray one something better than Sage. Probably something botanical and eccentric that no one else would have thought of. She had a gift for names that were exactly right. He thought, I'll have to think of what she would have named her. Take some time with it. That was the first time in 11 months he had made a plan that extended beyond the current week. Spring came the way it always does in eastern Tennessee. Not gradually, but in sudden negotiations. Cold one day and warm the next, until one morning in late March, you walk outside and the air has a smell in it that means the decision has been made. The fox was released at the edge of the property on a morning when the ground was soft with new rain, and Marcus watched her from a distance with Flint at his side, though Flint had the restraint, for once, to stay quiet. The fox stopped once at the tree line, turned back, considered them both for a moment with those yellow, uncompromising eyes, and then was gone. Go on, Marcus said, though she already had. He'd contacted the Veterans Support Group in Clover Ridge sometime in February. He hadn't gone to a meeting yet. But he had the number in his phone, and once, on a Tuesday evening when Scout was resting his head on Marcus's knee, and the farmhouse felt suddenly too big in all the wrong places, he had looked at the number for a long time. He thought he might call it. Maybe next week. He'd started taking Flint to the river in the mornings. Flint had discovered moving water with the same fullness of feeling he brought to everything, and now required daily immersion, which meant Marcus was walking 3 miles in the morning before the light was fully up, which meant he was sleeping better, which his body had been asking for without his permission for almost a year. Sage had finally settled on an organizational system for the boots that Marcus had accepted and now worked within. Left boots on the shelf, right boots near the door. He didn't know why, but he'd stopped fighting it. Scout still watched, still arrived, still settled, still stayed. Occasionally in the evenings he would cross the kitchen to where Marcus was sitting and press his nose briefly to Marcus's hand, not demanding anything, not seeking praise, just checking, making sure. The kind of check-in Marcus had once performed himself, years ago, on men he was responsible for keeping safe. He understood now why Cole had stood the way he'd stood in that forward operating base, hands at his sides, face still. It wasn't that there was nothing happening inside him. It was that there was too much, and none of it had words yet. You had to carry it until it found another shape. That was the only way through. You couldn't go around it, and you couldn't set it down, but you could, with time and the right kind of company, carry it until it became something different. Not lighter exactly, but more familiar, less sharp, like a stone worn smooth by a river you've learned to swim in. Marcus had learned this from 3 dogs he hadn't meant to keep. The farmer's market in Clover Ridge started up again in April, and on a Saturday morning when the air was mild and Sage had reorganized his coffee mugs for reasons he'd stopped asking about, Marcus loaded all 3 dogs into the truck and drove into town. He wasn't sure why he did it. He told himself it was for the tomato starts. He decided to put in a garden, another thing he hadn't planned, another next year thought arriving ahead of schedule. But really he just wanted to go somewhere with them, wanted other people to see them, wanted to stand in the sun with a cup of farmer's market coffee, and have Flint put his paws on the edge of the vegetable display, and be politely asked to stop, and have Sage investigate every bag and basket within reach, with her expression of considered skepticism, and have Scout sit beside his leg and watch the crowd with the steady alertness of a very small, very serious professional. A little girl in a yellow raincoat crouched down in front of Scout and said, "What's that mark on his chest?" "That's his," Marcus said. "He was born with it." She looked at it seriously, then looked up at Marcus. "Does it mean something?" Marcus looked down at Scout, who was looking at the girl with an expression of genuine goodwill, one of the few times Marcus had seen him look at something new without the assessment running behind his eyes. "Yeah," Marcus said, "I think it does." He bought the tomato starts and 2 kinds of pepper plant and a jar of honey from a beekeeper who'd retired here from Vermont and had a lot to say about the flowering season. He shook hands with a man who turned out to be the organizer of the veterans group, who had heard Marcus's name from Carol and said, "Come, when you're ready. No pressure, no timeline." He threw a ball for Flint on the town green for 20 minutes and lost track of the time, which had not happened to him in over a year. On the drive home, Sage was asleep across his lap in a way that made steering technical, but not impossible. Flint was in the truck bed with his nose in the wind, which Marcus had decided he was allowed to do at low speeds if he wore the old bandana tied to the roll bar so Marcus could see him in the mirror. Scout was on the passenger seat, looking out the window at the greening hills. The farmhouse came into view around the last bend, the old gray wood, the tin roof catching the light, the porch where Marcus had spent so many hours last year just trying to get through the dark. The garden beds were turned and ready. The fox was somewhere out in those woods, doing fox things. There was honey in the bag, and tomato starts on the floor, and a phone number in his pocket for a meeting he thought he might go to. He turned onto the gravel road, and felt the familiar crunch of it under the tires, the sound that had started to mean home again, which it hadn't for a while. Scout looked at him. Marcus looked back. "I know," he said. "I know." He meant it as gratitude, for the 4 a.m. vigil, for the boot against his knee, for the steady, unremarkable presence that had asked nothing of him, and given him back something he hadn't known he was still missing. He meant it as a kind of reckoning, the kind that doesn't ask you to be finished grieving, only to agree to keep moving. And maybe he meant it for Laura too, somewhere. For the red coat and the extra syllable and the dog she'd always wanted, and the next year that finally, in the way of things that cannot be rushed, had arrived. He pulled up to the farmhouse and turned off the engine, and the 3 of them. Flint already scrambling, Sage waking in degrees, Scout steady as ever, poured out into the April morning like they owned it. Which, Marcus had come to understand, they did.